So let's start with a big question. What if the system that decides who gets to stay in the US and who gets deported wasn't actually built by the government, but by a single, pretty secretive tech company? Well, today, we're going to dive into an investigative report that claims that's exactly what's happening.
So, what is the brain, the central intelligence hub behind America's immigration and customs enforcement? You might think it's some government agency, right? But according to the report we're breaking down today, the answer is, well, something else entirely.
Yeah, the report claims it's not some government-built system at all. Instead, it's designed, operated, and constantly updated by one private company, Palantir Technologies. And if you're not familiar with them, they have some really deep ties to both the intelligence community and Silicon Valley.
All right, so to really get how Palantir became so crucial to this whole process, we've got to start with the core idea at the heart of the report. It's a system they call Immigration OS.
So what is Immigration OS? The report basically defines it as this massive, integrated intelligence ecosystem. Honestly, you can think of it as the operating system for deportation. Its whole purpose is to pull in literally billions of data points from all over the place to create a single, constantly updated profile for agents to use.
And this quote from co-founder Peter Thiel's book, wow, it really frames the company's entire approach. Competition is for losers. The idea isn't just to win a contract, it's to become so essential, so embedded, that the government literally can't function without you. A functional monopoly, really.
Okay, so that's the big picture. But how does this digital machine actually work? The report breaks down its architecture into a few key parts.
So the core engine, the thing that agents are using every single day right now, is a system called Investigative Case Management, or ICM. You can think of Immigration OS as the next-gen platform, but ICM is the current workhorse.
And here's how the information actually moves through the system. First, an agent uses what's called the Interface Hub to query dozens of separate databases. We're talking FBI, state DMVs, commercial sources, all from a single search bar. Super efficient. Then the data warehouse takes all that information, analyzes it, and starts connecting the dots, mapping out networks of people, places, and events. And finally, and this is a big one, agents can set what the report calls a tripwire. This is basically an automated alert that pings them anytime their target's information, like a new address or a license plate scan, pops up anywhere in the system.
And that tripwire feature leads to something really significant. It creates a system of passive surveillance. What does that mean? Well, instead of an agent having to actively search for someone day after day, they can just set a tripwire and wait. The system does the work for them, sending a notification as soon as their target's data shows up anywhere in the grid.
Right, so an engine this powerful needs a constant supply of fuel. In this case, that fuel is data. But where does all of this data actually come from? The answer, as laid out in the report, is, well, it's pretty unsettling.
Okay, so one of the biggest findings in the report is that a ton of this data isn't seized by the government with a warrant. It's purchased. It's bought on the open market from private data brokers. Just look at this slide. We're talking about utility and credit data from places like LexisNexis to track down addresses, billions of license plate scans from a company called Vigilant Solutions, and even mobile location history that's bought from vendors like Ventel.
And this right here, this is the legal loophole at the heart of the report's argument. See, normally, for the government to get your private data, they need a warrant signed by a judge. But the report argues that by buying that same data from a commercial broker, they can often sidestep the Fourth Amendment. This all hinges on a legal theory called the third-party doctrine, which basically says you don't have a reasonable expectation of privacy for info you willingly give to a third party, like your bank or your cell phone provider.
And there's another major data pipeline the report identifies, these 80 regional fusion centers. Now, these are hubs where federal, state, and local law enforcement all share information. The report calls them a back door because they allow federal agents to access local police data, things like arrest records or license plate scans, even in so-called sanctuary cities that have policies specifically designed to prevent that kind of sharing.
So we've looked at the architecture and the data, which is all a bit abstract. But what does this system actually look like in practice? The report gets into several real-world deployments that really show the human side of this technology.
Take this number, 680 arrests. In 2019, ICE carried out the largest single-state workplace raid in U.S. history at some poultry plants in Mississippi. The source material we're looking at details exactly how Palantir's software was used to comb through employment records and plan the logistics for this massive operation, which ended up separating hundreds of families.
But the report also details what it calls the sponsor trap, it's a really controversial use of the system. Here's how it worked. Data from different agencies was fused together. So when a family member or sponsor came forward to help an unaccompanied minor in the custody of Health and Human Services, their information was run through the Palantir system. And in some cases, that led to the sponsor themselves being identified and arrested by ICE. And of course, you have to follow the money. The report points directly to Palantir's public filings, which show their U.S. government revenue growing a lot year over year. This isn't just about a company making a profit. The report argues it highlights just how much the government is starting to rely on private contractors for its most essential functions.
But the document we're examining doesn't just stop at diagnosing the problem. The final part is actually framed as a kind of tactical manual for how individuals and communities can push back against this system.
It basically outlines two main strategies. First is starving the machine of data through what it calls digital self-defense. This includes some really practical steps, like using encrypted messaging apps like Signal, which makes your communications much harder to intercept. It also suggests using passcodes instead of biometrics like Face ID. Why? Because you can be legally compelled to unlock a phone with your fingerprint, but not necessarily with your password. The second strategy is all about policy action, pushing for local laws that demand transparency around surveillance tech contracts so the public at least knows what's being used in their own communities.
And this quote from the report really just ties a bow on the whole argument for resistance. The idea is that the system's biggest strength, its total dependence on a constant stream of data, is also its biggest weakness. If you can disrupt that data flow, you can challenge the system. In other words, the very thing that makes this digital Panopticon so powerful is also what makes it vulnerable.
Which really leaves us with one final big question to chew on. A question posed by the implications of this whole report. When we build these massive, complex systems, all designed for maximum efficiency, what are the hidden costs of that efficiency? And are we, as a society, willing to pay that price?